Good morning, everyone. I'm Dave Feldman. I'm Director of Water UCI. We're just going to give it about another minute for people to check in. Welcome. We're glad that you could join us for this colloquium. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you to our colloquium entitled Tapping into the Future, Potable Reuse in Tomorrow's World. And before I introduce our distinguished panelists, we're very grateful that they could be with us this morning. I want to just announce a couple of upcoming events, one upcoming event in particular. On Tuesday, May 18th, Greg Pierce, who's a professor with UCLA's Luskin Institute for Policy Innovation, is going to be talking about drinking water and justice issues in California. That will be our last colloquium for Water UCI this academic year at the University of California, Irvine. And also want to thank a number of people for their production help. Most of all, I want to start by thanking the Associate Director of Water UCI, Shannon Roback, for organizing this. And I want to thank the School of Social Ecology and its staff for all of their support in webcasting and publicity. And last but not least, I want to thank our panelists and all of you in the audience who have joined this morning. This will be a 1-hour symposium. We have some prearranged questions that our panelists have been able to reflect on and launch in any direction they care to. And then with the remaining time, we'll close out promptly at 11:30, we will take audience questions as time permits. There is a Q&A function on Zoom. We urge, if you have questions you would like addressed, please use that function, not the chat function. With that, I want to introduce our distinguished panelists. In order, David Hannigan, who's an assistant professor of environmental engineering at the University of Nevada, Reno. Rabia Chaudhry, who is a national water research expert with the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Eva Steinley-Darling, who's the water reuse technical practice director at Carollo Engineers. And Megan Plumley, Director of Research and Development at the Orange County Water District. Thank you all. It is a real privilege to have you at this panel this morning on this very important issue and just a tremendous opportunity. I want to start out with this question. Drawing on experiences where potable reuse has been successfully adopted, what lessons can decision makers apply regarding ways to improve public outreach, education, and opportunities to visit recycling facilities? Are these methods sufficient to instill public confidence in potable reuse? If not, what more is needed? David, let's start with you.
Sure, thanks, Dave. Happy to be here. Happy to answer the first question, to take the first crack at it. So I guess my thoughts here are that there really needs to be a strong need, right? So perhaps in the East Coast, there's less of a need for recycled water, and so people are probably less likely to be accepting of it, independent of really how much education or how much tours of facility you provide. But if there is a strong need and the public is convinced that there's a strong need, education is kind of the most important part. And so I don't just mean education by the utility, but I mean education prior to this event where they start doing reuse, right? So it's been demonstrated in published literature that higher levels of educated people are more accepting of potable reuse. And so, if you have a population base that is highly educated, I think you have it easier off. If not, you really need to start early in convincing the public that this is a great way to treat water and to get them kind of on board with it, right?
Great, thank you for kicking us off. Rabia, welcome.
Thank you. Great, mute button. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. It really is great to be part of this conversation. So just a couple things I wanted to mention before I answer the question. Since I'm an EPA employee, I wanted to mention that the views I expressed during today's discussion are my own and do not necessarily represent the views or policies of the EPA. And with that out of the way, we can get to the question. So this is a really, really critical aspect of implementing successful water reuse programs. And I kind of want to take a bigger picture view of this. The general public's understanding, baseline understanding around water provision itself is actually very low. A recent nationally representative survey on water knowledge by Water Maine came out last year, and it showed that Americans don't have deep knowledge of water issues. About half only correctly answered basic questions around water infrastructure topics. Half of the respondents, and this was nationally representative, so about 1,000 people across the entire country, half don't know where their tap water comes from. So, water reuse professionals are leading the way, honestly, when it comes to communications and outreach, and by necessity, because we have to. But, we're operating in this environment of just lower knowledge around water among the public in general. So it's really important to keep that perspective and understand the overall, the big hill we have to climb, if you will, altogether. So with that said, I did want to say that, there are lots of great examples, and I wanted to kind of mention just a couple that come to mind. The key really here is about prioritizing communications and outreach in the work itself, and that takes a lot of effort, and bringing in the right professionals, the communications professionals, to do that job right. These are not engineers necessarily; these are people with different backgrounds, and then understanding the specific misconceptions of your community that you're dealing with, and then tailoring your response to those specific issues. And I want to say really quickly about, I think Albuquerque did a really great job recently. They are actually a community that does not have much reuse experience. And they provide water for more than 600,000 people in the Albuquerque metro area. But they've included IPR, direct potable reuse, and indirect potable reuse in their 100-year water plan. And they conducted a community survey to diagnose the knowledge gaps. They found that people are aware, that over 80% are aware that water is scarce in their area, and that they trust the trustworthiness of academic professionals, you all, and medical professionals is paramount. So, they're working on, I think, developing their approaches, but to us, this speaks of the rest of us, across the country, thinking about really clearly about misconceptions and developing those processes. I'll stop there and talk a little bit about, some of the work we're doing at the EPA later. We are exploring some options on developing outreach materials with the medical community. So,
excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Rabia. Eva?
Sure. So I fully support and agree with everything that's been said so far. I think my spin on this question is, and in my mind, the most important thing you can do to have a successful potable reuse outreach program is to have an outreach program before you ever think about potable reuse, right? So it's answering the same question, but backwards is it's the education question. It's you can do it nationwide, but utilities focusing on their own service area, building that trust, building communication, building that knowledge base well ahead of any kind of controversial project, be that potable reuse or something else. And you're going to have a much better chance of being heard because you already have that conduit, whereas the dissenting voices and the other voices that are creating, misinformation, just won't be able to have that space because you already own it. And it gives you a more educated public and a more trusting public to move forward if they know you're delivering a quality service and they're aware of that. So that's kind of my spin on that, and my example that I love to cite. And obviously Orange County Water District has a fantastic outreach program, but one of my favorites is El Paso Water, because they have so many different projects, different water scarcity challenges that they've overcome over the years, and they just have a fantastic outreach program that's been through all of their programming, right? It's potable reuse was just one more step in that progression.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And last but not least, Megan.
Yes, hello, thank you. Great comments from everyone. So just to add maybe something that hasn't been mentioned yet, that Orange County Water District, my organization, has done, in addition to the public outreach, like Eva mentioned, with social media. But back when the project started. And then before then, like Aoife said, before our project actually came online and OCWD, we did do public communication outreach. Engineers were actually knocking on doors, among other methods. But now we have social media, right? So of course, that's a great tool to leverage. And it never ends, you know, we have a public affairs department that is a small team, but keeps it so we have an updated website, great information, you know, lots of social media updates. And we have like a children's water festival and things like that. But to mention something different, I think something really interesting, and I believe OCWD was the first to do it, but I'm not entirely sure, so I shouldn't take too much credit. But it's become kind of the norm now for potable reuse projects, is to establish an independent advisory panel of technical experts. And that's what Rabia was kind of talking about, where you can leverage the opinions and know-how of medical community, for example, or others. And you know, unfortunately, there is a little bit sometimes of a natural mistrust of a government entity, i.e. your local water utility, trying to get you to drink recycled wastewater. So the public, I think, perceives the project better when there are these independent panels. And so ours meets every year. We put on a big 2-day event for them. There are all kinds of different types of experts from a range of sciences. We put on a nice workshop where we are very transparent and our staff pick topics and we get up and present new challenges we're facing. We really take advantage of them and get their advice, but the main driver was to establish an independent, you know, body outside of our own staff and board of directors to lend credibility. And that's actually been studied in the scholarly literature as part of the social legitimization of new ideas, including potable reuse, is this idea of independent technical experts, especially academics, because the public has a tendency to really trust academic scholars. But we have a mix of academics and other types of experts on our panel.
Excellent panelists. Thank you for your observations and comments. I want to move to a little more technical question. Is indirect potable reuse employing an environmental buffer between the source and the user, such as a groundwater basin, obviously something done here in Orange County, only a means of boosting public trust and confidence? Or does it also make scientific sense by providing additional natural treatment of effluent before use? And again, let's start, David, with you.
Sure, thanks, Dave. So yeah, I had a lot of fun with this question. I actually couldn't make up my own mind. I guess what I arrived at, in my opinion, is that you know, this is probably not the best use of our effort. And I'll play devil's advocate, and I'll give you an example of a reason that maybe you do want to do it in the end here. But you know, overall, this is a bunch of energy and time that we're spending, and I don't think that it's doing too much in terms of the actual water quality. So there are probably trade-offs between things that get removed from the, you know, RO, the highly treated wastewater that get removed in the aquifer or whatever the environmental buffer is, but there's also things that get picked up, right? And so whether or not this is a benefit or actually a risk is the real question. I think the science is still kind of out on that. And so to me, you know, I think the bigger picture here is that both are extraordinarily safe sources of water. And so it feels a little bit like we're sort of nitpicking, you know, which one's better? Well, to me, the one that costs less energy is better. And so that sort of skips the environmental buffer. However, like I said, I'll play devil's advocate here. So, you know, there is an example where you can form very low concentrations of a carcinogenic chemical, nitrosodimethylamine, right? And we know this thing gets attenuated in aquifers over time. So that's really hard to do with an engineered structure, right? To provide some microbiology and large amounts of residence time to remove this chemical. But again, it's very low concentration. And what else am I picking up in the aquifer that might actually outweigh the benefits? So I think that it's probably a use of energy that's not worthwhile. At the same time, if it does help to convince people that this is you know, water that they can drink, then I suppose that maybe we have to do it.
Very thoughtful. Thank you, David. Rabia, your reaction.
We're going in the same order. Okay. I remember reading like scores and scores of papers about this in grad school, and I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to, I mean, kind of like David, I agree with him that the jury's a bit out on this, but I'll bring up another kind of more operational and policy question here. So the environmental buffer does play, so when we talk about the primary thing that an environmental buffer does is give you time. And, you know, hopefully Megan will have some other thoughts to share on this, but, you know, just from like a public health and regulatory perspective, again, not EPA's thoughts, is that, you know, the environmental buffer gives you some important time and delay between treatment and provision of the water to the public, even when you're assuming additional treatment. So, you know, even if you're assuming no additional treatment in the aquifer. And so, you know, you can think about pathogen removal. There's lots of conversation about, you know, research about some minor amounts for viruses potentially, but it's unclear. But even if you assume there's no treatment, when there is a spike for example, in an outbreak, particularly a viral outbreak, you'd expect those concentrations of viruses, you know, say norovirus, elevated in the wastewater. And then, you know, assuming that you have a certain amount of treatment expected, and, you know, usually advanced treatment trains are built with redundancy, but, you know, we're talking about you know, an extreme case here. In an outbreak, you would get some additional time in the aquifer to make sure that there is no, you know, the public health is protected at the tap. Similarly, chemical constituent spikes from industrial discharges within the sewer shed. You know, a lot of potable reuse, you know, cities with potable reuse plants do put a lot of effort into pretreatment and kind of, you know, having those enhanced pretreatments at the discharge site. But, you know, it is a lot of additional effort, and having that additional time could support and mitigate some of those spikes. So it may not necessarily offer treatment, but it can allow time to test, monitor, and take any adaptive measurements before you know, to protect public health.
Good point. Thank you very much. Eva.
Thanks, Dave. So I'm going to take a little bit wider angle view of this question, because I think the answer to the question, I think everybody is recognizing, is there's more than just public perception benefit to an environmental buffer. And of course, you know, the most important decision in a practitioner's mind when I'm implementing a project is, well, is there even a suitable environmental buffer available, right? And in many places there just aren't. There isn't an aquifer, there isn't a surface water, there isn't a good environmental buffer for me to put that water. And so in those circumstances, direct potable reuse makes sense, right? We're confident we can engineer those systems, and we can engineer them to be safe for public consumption. But coming back to the environmental buffer, they provide a number of benefits, right? They not just to the treatment, which, you know, you have the response retention time that Rabia was talking about, you have potential attenuation and dilution effects, which can help, you know, broaden out those peaks. But a major cost factor for a lot of these projects is storage, right? So if you have an aquifer, or if you have a large reservoir, and you can put your water in there when you have it and take it out when you need it, you have a built-in storage volume that would be incredibly expensive if we had to build it from scratch. The same thing, especially in a surface water scenario, you know, we have a myriad of potential benefits between, you know, riparian and ecosystem benefits for in-stream flows, or, you know, recreational benefits. If we're creating a reservoir, we're helping maintain reservoir levels. So, you know, if you take a larger sort of socioeconomic picture of the projects, you can see there are a number of benefits, if you have one available, of including that environmental buffer in your potable reuse project. And you know, the treatment aspect, or the actual benefit it provides to the narrow project may be a small component of its overall benefit.
Very good thoughts. Megan.
Sure, yeah. So just to kind of redefine it again for the new folks in the audience, yeah, so direct potable reuse would be where you take the wastewater and advanced purify it to drinking water quality, and then just put it into a drinking water treatment plant or right into the distribution system. So there's no step where it's kind of in Mother Nature again, sitting underground in the groundwater aquifer. that acts as storage, like Ava said, or in a surface water reservoir. So it kind of, in the public's mind, gets renaturalized, but like Professor Hannigan was saying, could pick up, now you've put it back out in nature again. So if you draw it out of a reservoir, you're going to have to do normal drinking water treatment again to purify it. So there are trade-offs. And I just always think about how ultimately, whether the environmental buffer approach, IPR, indirect potable reuse, or DPR makes more sense, is just going to be so site specific to the community. And what it really does is give communities options, because it's hard to explain quickly, without like a case study example. But basically, engineers and planners have to look at kind of the land. Is there a buffer at all? Even if there is, maybe it makes sense to use it, but based on where it is and where the water demand is, where are the pipes, where would new pipes have to be put in for DPR, stuff like that. So, just to give the quick example of my organization, at the time DPR wasn't an option from a regulatory perspective, so we did build an indirect system. So we take the advanced purified water. It's municipal wastewater from our local sanitation agency. We take that partially treated now water and advanced purify it up to a drinking water standard with membranes and other technologies. And then we pipe it a pretty long distance, about 13 miles. So that's energy to a spot where it's a good spot for putting water in the ground, because the sandy, easily, percolating aquifer sand goes up to the ground level there. So we have big man-made ponds, and this advanced purified water sinks into the ground. It makes a lot of sense for us because we have the aquifer. It's a great storage system. But what makes even more sense is there were already 19 cities and water agencies in our big 2.5 million person service area that existed and had spent millions building groundwater production wells. They're on groundwater, they're pumping the water out. That is their drinking water supply. As we got more populated, those water levels dropped and dropped and dropped. And we have an issue because we're on the coast and we're going to get seawater intrusion. So not only were the water levels potentially going to drop below where the groundwater well was screened, so it wouldn't work anymore, you'd lose the water source, but also you'd have seawater salt intrusion into the drinking water supply. So by putting the water in that location in Anaheim where we recharge it, it recharges this whole aquifer and flows down gradient now. So reverse direction of the pumping direction where we got it there to all these cities' wells. So it's like a free distribution system. It would be unimaginable the cost of us now building like a pipeline system and piping this water that we purify out to like 19 different cities. Already the infrastructure is there, and it's the aquifer, it's the pipe that got the water to the recharge site, it's those man-made ponds that we have to maintain and remove vegetation. So all those wells, it's already been built, it works, and it works well, and we have really great water quality. And so people ask us, are you guys going to do DPR now that California has the regulations coming out soon, and now it's going to be able to be done in the state? It doesn't make sense for us to tear out what we have, but it certainly could make sense for a new community that's now looking at their options, looking at their land area, looking at their pipes, and now they get a choice, IPR or DPR. And there's even kind of choices within those, right? Because there's different types of buffers. If you go IPR, there's different ways to do DPR. So what we really need is just lots of options. And I think we're getting more and more of them in states and around the country.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you all. Your last set of comments was really a great segue to our third question. Going to mix things up a little bit and change the order around. The question is, would firm, clear, national level guidance and regulatory standards for potable reuse be an effective means of encouraging wastewater reuse adoption, as opposed to continuing to allow states to sort of set the bar? Eva, why don't we start with you? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. I think there's a kind of a two-part answer to that question. I think for those states that have not yet embarked on potable reuse, and there are many of those, especially now on the East Coast, and there are a number of East Coast communities that have strong drivers for reuse that are not associated with water supply, right? They're associated with discharge prohibitions and nutrient management challenges. And so there are a lot of states struggling right now and grappling, and we have projects in a number of states where the regulatory community is really struggling to have the context, and they don't know whose voice to listen to, right? They have one approach out of California, another approach out of Texas. There's confusion about certainly the Texas approach because there's not much published about that and how it works. And so I do very firmly believe that some level of guidance that provides a backstop, kind of, if you will, a minimum standard, like we do with almost every other regulatory paradigm, to say, you know, this is what you should be doing at minimum, and states have the option of building on that to make it their own. And California is a great example of doing that in a lot of respects. So, you know, I understand my perspective may be a little bit controversial, and I'm looking forward to hear what the other panelists have to say. You know, I think there are a lot of people who are concerned about, you know, how do we grandfather in existing projects? How do we make a unified basic standard that actually provides the function we want it to provide without creating problems in states that have functioning systems, right? And there are more and more of those coming online. They've kind of gone through the pain of this regulatory process at the state level, and they have their solution and they like it, right? And so I don't have a good path, and there are challenges along there, but I think the end result of a national guidance that goes beyond just a published document, but really says, here's the basic standard, would go a long way towards encouraging the adoption of reuse nationwide.
Very good, thank you. David, over to you.
Sure, thanks, Dave. I don't know if I have that strong of an opinion here, so I'll just keep it short. But you know, I think that my biggest comment would be that the EPA is a very big ship, and it turns slowly, right? And so, at the risk of maybe making Rabia angry at me, but it makes sense that right now we have kind of a more nimble way to regulate these things on a state-by-state basis, because the EPA ship is still sort of turning. I think they're going to get there for sure, and I do think that that's beneficial overall to have, you know, kind of the mothership, if you will, have some clear guidance all around. And they'll have to figure out some complicated things, like Eva was saying, about trying to grandfather in some existing, you know, infrastructure. But you know, overall, I think that in terms of the water safety, you know, we're doing a great job now, or the states are doing a great job now. And in the long term, as this idea kind of spreads and it becomes you know, proliferated across the US, but we will probably want to have a little bit more clear national guidance to ensure that things continue to be as safe as they are now.
Thank you, David. And Megan, let's go over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess I don't have a really strong opinion either, because I tend to get analysis paralysis, and I feel like I see both sides of it. On the one hand, our country, the way it was founded, I mean, states really like having independence and setting their own ways of doing things and not having too much control federally. But I also really recognize that when a state has no existing guidance, just like Asa was saying, it can be hard to know where to start. And so if they could look to regulations at the federal level, that may be helpful. I feel like, so with the analysis paralysis, I guess I start thinking about what's like the middle ground. And I almost think we kind of already have that, which is guidelines at the federal level. And maybe I haven't studied them all that closely lately, so maybe they could be improved. But essentially guidelines at the federal level that have been developed through a consensus process and are updated means that a state who has no local state regulations or examples of projects within their own state could look to those guidelines, but then still have the freedom to develop their project the way they want to by looking at the other states who have done it and getting to pick and choose what has been the most successful or what is most suitable to their local community with their context and public education and things like that. I think that also guidelines can have an enormous amount of power, because at the end of the day, even if it's not a regulation with teeth in the same way, a guidance from the EPA that says, here's the safe thing that you need to do for the water to be safe, you know, like, I mean, no state wants to come out with a different approach that then someone can say, why do you omit this aspect of the framework or process or water quality objectives or treatment technologies or whatever, because this is what the EPA recommends for a safe and reliable potable reuse system. So I think guidelines can still be really powerful. And I think kind of a different example of that is PFAS in the state of California. We don't have a maximum contaminant level, which would be like an example of a federal or a state limit that sets the requirement for how much PFAS can be allowed to be in the drinking water for it to be safe. But they do have guidelines. And now we have And that, eventually they want to develop an MCL, but it's just guideline called a response level right now. But it's a level of PFAS that the state of California says, we really don't recommend you have above this much in your drinking water. You should think about treating or taking that drinking water supply out of service. Well, that's a really powerful statement from the state. So all of the, impacted water retailers in the state are now treating, to remove down to that level, despite the fact that it's just a guidance value and not a true regulatory limit. So I think that's just an example of how powerful guidelines can be in the absence of an actual regulation.
Great, thank you very much. Rabia, appropriately, you get to.
I see what you did there, David. That was nice. That was good. I actually really appreciate hearing everyone's perspective, and thank you for that, David, to help me, let me go last. Yeah, just great perspectives from everybody. And again, I just want to emphasize, I'll talk a little bit about, which part of the EPA I'm in. I'm part of the water reuse team, which was recently formalized under the Office of Water. We are non-regulatory. The regulatory work happens from program offices that are different from our team. Our team serves as a technical resource in addition to supporting implementation of the National Water Reuse Plan, National Water Reuse Action Plan, or the RAP. And just really quickly, for those of you who are not familiar, the National Water Reuse Action Plan, or RAP, was developed in 2020 with federal, state, tribal, local, and water sector partners to build technical, financial, and institutional capacity for communities to pursue water reuse practice. The RAP coordinates efforts of more than 100 organizations into over 40 different actions pertaining to municipal, agricultural, stormwater, and industrial sectors. And last week, we celebrated our 1-year anniversary of RAP collaborative implementation, and released an update document, reviewing progress over the past year and thinking ahead to the work that still remains to be done. A recording of that is available, and I can share that with you all. So I just want to kind of mention really quickly that this effort, the RAP effort, is really quite a different approach that the EPA has taken. And I don't believe an effort like this has happened before on a topic of this significance. So in the absence, as everybody on the panel just mentioned, EPA does not restrict or require any type of reuse and does not have specific regulations at the federal level. And states do maintain primacy in terms of regulation and developing those governance structures. Part of the reason our team is supporting this work is so we can work together with states and with the reuse community overall, all of different partners included, and hear from them and understand what kinds of support is required. What we've heard very clearly from states is that, the drivers are just so different. And I believe Megan and Ava also mentioned this, that the western part of the country is very arid, really driven, Southwest, Texas included, driven by water scarcity, long-term drought, and impending climate crisis, and all of these issues. So water reuse for various purposes, including potable, is becoming a necessity. It's not an option anymore in these places. And the approaches, the regulatory approaches on these states, they're moving ahead, and that's reflected. On the eastern U.S., the challenge is quite different. It's around flooding, if you will. It's around extreme weather events, and these states are looking at approaches around managing that as well, and managing things like Hampton Roads in Virginia, for example, and around the Chesapeake. They're trying to figure out how to manage land subsidence and saltwater intrusion and those kinds of things. So what we see our role at the federal level is to support the states with science and guidance and help them develop regulations to enable reuse as a normalized option among many integrated water management approaches. So we're doing this in a few different ways. One thing, EPA, not our team, but EPA over the last few decades has published guidelines for water reuse. 1980, 1992, 2004, and 2012, and then the Potable Reuse Compendium 2017, which I'm sure everybody here knows about. Our team is supporting some 3 actions that I'll mention really quickly in the wrap. The first one is compiling fit for purpose existing state policies and guidelines and regulations. So this compilation is looking at regulations across all different states, all 50 states, and looking at their the specific guidelines and fit for purpose specifications for different types of uses, and also delving into their technical basis. This kind of compilation really hasn't been done before, and it's very what we're hearing is that those states who are still a little bit kind of, working and thinking and asking about what kinds of regulations and guidance on this topic, they would find this very useful because they can easily look at the technical basis for what other states are doing and use that as a template and apply it to their own specific local needs. And that's really what's needed. So we're hoping that this compilation and this web portal will be up by the end of this year. And we're really hoping that, states will find this helpful in developing their own approaches. This is action 3.1. Another action we're doing is enhancing state collaboration on water reuse. There's a number of organizations, Aqua, ASWA, Ecos, alphabet soup, I'm sorry. But this is action 2.2 on our online platform, and they've been hosting state summits to encourage collaboration and knowledge exchange among states for precisely this reason, to support states to be able to learn from each other. And then we're also supporting the work of the National Blue Ribbon Commission, this is action 3.4, in developing on-site water reuse approaches. This is actually really critical because, one of the approaches New York City is taking, for example, is to, use on-site on-site non-potable reuse, decentralized within the city to retain stormwater on the properties to allow centralized wastewater treatment to, minimize combined sewer overflows. So that's kind of a very Eastern US water-rich area issue. So anyway, I'll stop talking because this has gone on for a while, but the main thing I wanted to mention really is that our team is, the RAP is really young. Our team was just formalized this year, and we absolutely hear and are, interested and engaging with the community and are sensitive to the needs of the community. And, we're working on thinking through what kinds of support and additional guidance, in addition to this work that I've already highlighted, can be done.
Great, thank you very much. This has really been an illuminating segment, and I'm so glad that we record this. Goldmine of great information. As we move to our last question, I do want to remind the audience that we will probably have some time for questions. Please use the Q&A function if you have a question that you'd like to submit to the panel. I want to move finally from my end to a more international perspective. We know that wastewater reuse has been widely adopted internationally. And the question for the panelists is, why is it the case that in places where it has been widely adopted, just a couple of examples, Australia, Israel, Singapore, its application is mostly for agriculture or for high-tech manufacturing and not for direct household use? Is this an economic decision, or do you think there are other reasons? What are your observations on this? And let's go ahead and start with Megan.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to my comment earlier about how water is such a site-specific issue, just really driven by where your pumps and pipes are, where the land is, what your community needs are, what the water demands are. So you make the site, so when it comes to water, wastewater reuse broadly, whether it's non-potable, potable, industrial uses, ag, municipal, you make the decision that makes the most sense for your community. And economics will be a huge driver, because at the end of the day, while we wish that things like environmental factors were number one, often the economics is number one as far as the weight for the decision. that there are cost impacts that mean real things for the community and their water bills if it's not a cost-effective project. So I think my short answer would just be that it's logical when a community starts out to use the natural, quote unquote, natural sources of water first, because that's the cheapest. So your flowing rivers and your full aquifers, groundwater system. And when that becomes more depleted, hopefully not totally, because there would hopefully in your community be regulations that require leaving some water for the environment, like a flowing stream. But once you've taken all that you kind of can, your population continues to grow, you might look to other water sources like imported water. And then usually next proceed to thinking about reuse. And then it just is kind of, I think, natural that folks then first start thinking about non-potable forms of reuse. Because if you have a big agricultural demand, or you have a big city zoo that's using tons of your potable water, drinking water supply, or you have an industry that needs high purity water, taking the wastewater and treating it to the level that's needed for that need, that's a non-potable need, could make a lot of sense. You're not dealing with the public outreach and communication needs as much, but still, just maybe not as much. So then perhaps you proceed to potable reuse after that. So I think it's kind of a natural progression. But as potable reuse has begun to be more accepted, there are cases where you can skip, like maybe the community says we could import water, but that's gonna be super, maybe not as great for the environment and pretty expensive, and deal with the politics of taking water from another community and arguing about it. So perhaps we should do potable reuse. So I think that there are cases now where folks might skip and go right to potable reuse, which I think is great. That was supposed to be short, sorry.
Great, thank you very much. David, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll just build on what Megan was saying by sort of speaking to the examples that were given. So it's very site specific, right? So for example, Israel is using a huge amount of their treated wastewater effluent on agriculture rather than drinking water. I think there's a pretty good reason, right? So treating the wastewater to an agricultural standard is much less energy intensive than it is at drinking water. And so if you just don't have any water and pretty much all your drinking water is coming from desalination, and you can use this wastewater effluent without doing RO, without just doing the most energy intensive part of the process, and put it on agriculture, it makes sense, right? Because to give it to people, you're probably going to want to do RO. And so now you're going to actually use more energy, and now you need to find water for the crops anyway, which is probably going to come from the ocean through desalination. So this is probably the least energy intensive way of doing things. And that's kind of why they've gotten there. You could juxtapose that with Singapore, right, where they're doing virtually no agriculture because they just don't have any space. They actually are drinking a huge amount of their treated wastewater effluent, and they're doing reverse osmosis to make it into what they call new water. And so I think that it's just really site specific, and the economics have to play out where, if you're going to treat it to this very high level standard, it needs to be the case where that's beneficial instead of using it in something like agriculture.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Eva, what are your observations?
So I agree with all of the thoughts that have been brought up so far. And I think one way to think about it is just simply as you look at different sources of water supply, you're always going after the next lowest hanging fruit, right? And so that's more or less a summary, I think, of what Megan and David said, and I'm not going to repeat that. But I wanted to also contemplate the thought that the question may be not quite, has an underlying assumption that's not quite right. I think there is a lot of potable reuse internationally. And I think the differences that we're seeing is that they're not engineered in the same way as we tend to think of them. We might even look at them and say, wow, this is de facto reuse. But when you go one level deeper, and de facto reuse means unintentional reuse, where one downstream community will use effluent discharged by an upstream community as their source of water supply without any intentionality around it. And I think the thing I want to challenge is that in many cases that we would see as de facto reuse, even here in the US, but all over Central Europe as well, for example, is that those communities are very well aware that their water supply includes effluent. And, the European mindset in this whole one water paradigm is really protection of the environment. And so they're looking at additional treatment on the wastewater side prior to discharge, and their main concerns are associated with protecting that ecosystem. And so that's what they talk about, that's what they think about. But in the back of everyone's mind is the knowledge that part of protecting the ecosystem is to protect it as a resource for people to use as drinking. So we have potable reuse. We have it all over Europe. We have it all over anywhere that has any population density. It's a reality. And so, I think we, where we see some of these projects that are so highly engineered is the ones that we key in on. And in other places, it's probably not really accounted as reuse, if you will, in kind of the way that we think about it. And so I think I'd like to kind of leave the audience with the concept that reuse is actually everywhere, right? And so it's just these high profile projects that we hear about that are expensive and energy intensive, that are sometimes necessary to have those more direct connections for potable reuse that we undertake. And those are not necessarily the lowest hanging fruit in the reuse realm.
Very, very appropriate set of observations, and thanks for that clarification, Eva. Great. Rabia, we'll end with you.
Yeah, no, this is great. Great observations, everyone. So I'll point a little bit also to the political and kind of the overarching enabling environment in some of these places. That plays a huge role. So I'll actually start with Israel, because we have an Israel event. It's a 3-day event coming up in end of May 25th to 27th, that is open to the public, where you can come and hear all about Israel's history and policies and technologies around water reuse. And they actually, there is a session dedicated to exactly how they came to this decision on primarily using municipal wastewater for agriculture. And, in speaking with our Israeli colleagues, they have mentioned that one of the reasons was it was a policy decision on their part. And it kind of goes along with what David was saying, that it's a very arid country, and they decided to go with agricultural reuse to conserve freshwater resources because it was less risky in terms of public health. So that makes sense. But I mean, if you look at Singapore, for example, Singapore's drivers are also, they're highly central economy, very centrally, small country, centrally driven, and they're putting together a very, very ambitious program of not just water recycling, but also energy and nutrition, kind of food, kind of having these circular economies of water, energy, and food. And they actually have done a triumph, I would say, of public outreach by calling, they don't even call it wastewater, they call it used water. And it's really quite ingenious. And the community, the language around reuse it's not an option, because they are looking at sovereignty and kind of self-reliance. 40% of their water used to be from Malaysia. I don't know the exact numbers, but I think it's declining because some of their efforts, and they don't want to be dependent on Malaysia. And their efforts around kind of self-reliance is really kind of political will, bringing in the technology as needed, and using the resources and local levels that they have to get to that goal. Israel also has like a very similar approach, right? Kind of a centralized kind of decision-making at the top. So kind of, it's hard to generalize like that, but I want to echo, I agree with, the points that were made earlier, and it really comes down to what is appropriate for your own situation. Thinking about kind of bringing those perspectives, we often think about how those perspectives apply to the US. We have one team in the RAP that deals with, that's around this international collaboration and tech transfer. And we often, with Israeli colleagues, we've been talking about how those pieces apply to the US. And what comes up again and again is, scale. Like the US spans a continent. We have so many regions with different climates, and, water is a local issue. So even though we can talk about water quality and the regulations at the federal level or guidance at the federal level, the decision making around what makes sense in your community, they do end up being kind of local decisions. And when we think about a comparison between, say, Israel's approach and we would be better. It would be better to compare, the country of Israel to like one state in the U.S. because that is the appropriate scale. So I'm not gonna. So anyway, I think that's the really good points made, and it really does come down to very local decision making.
Oh, thank you very much. That was great. And Rabia, while I'm thinking of it, if you don't mind at some point to send us the link for this upcoming conference, would love to share it with our community, our Water UCI community. A number of us would definitely want to attend that webinar.
I'll put it in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. We do have a question from one member of the audience. It's directed principally at Megan, and I'm going to start with you, Megan, but I'm going to give other panelists an opportunity to respond to it. Megan, you mentioned that it doesn't make sense for OCWD to switch entirely to direct potable reuse because recharging the groundwater aquifer is already effective. However, since OCWD is looking at other sources of water, including desalination, at what point would you consider, OCWD consider, direct potable reuse in addition to indirect potable use and desalination?
When I listen to our leadership, it really isn't part of the conversation that there is some future where it would be considered. I think everybody just loves the way we're doing it now that's been so successful and the advantages of that environmental buffer, but things change over time. So I can't rule it out completely. We are considering ocean desalination because we are right there on the coast. And in our case, we would be like a purchaser of the water. We wouldn't like own and operate a desal plant. There's just a potential opportunity locally for this supply to become available that we could purchase. So we're thinking about that because we have a portfolio of different water supplies and there's strong advantages to having a diverse portfolio of multiple supplies. So that's one reason for the interest. So DPR would just be shipping about the same water resource or local wastewater in a different way versus ocean desal is like a new water source. So I think that's an important kind of distinction. Our current supply portfolio is naturally occurring groundwater that wasn't recharged, just the supply from rainwater infiltration. And a river that flows through that just before it gets out to the ocean, we divert it into our percolation ponds to use the groundwater as a storage system, like was mentioned earlier. In that case, not for potable reuse water, but for surface water that's being stored in a groundwater form. We also purchase imported water at great expense, and the costs are just going up and up and up. And looking at that, eventually, pretty soon, actually, the cost of ocean desal should be less expensive than our imported water. So maybe we'll be able to swap in ocean water for the imported water while still continuing with the wastewater reuse, because that's a supply we can manage locally, not
injection, right? So just, thinking of a splitter along your pipeline would be way less energy intensive to just bring the water directly to them instead of putting it in the ground first.
Yeah, I think if we lost our groundwater supply and we were thinking about direct potable reuse, we'd have to back up. We'd have an opportunity to start fresh and say, does centralized DPR or decentralized DPR make sense? So centralized is where you have your big wastewater treatment plant. We have a couple that are pretty near, not ours, but the Orange County Sanitation District operates 2 plants, but they're fairly close to the coast. And those are it as far as centralized plants. So that's where your supply of wastewater is. So if you do direct potable reuse, and our advanced water purification facility is next door to one of those wastewater treatment plants. So we're right there next to the supply, we purify it. So then we'd have to pipe the water out to do DPR to different cities and have to come up with some kind of arrangement. There's obviously existing drinking water distribution system. Maybe we could put it directly into the pipelines because we don't have any local drinking water treatment plants. So wouldn't be feasible for us to do DPR in the way where you put it into the headworks of a drinking water treatment plant because we don't have any. So as far as our current advanced purification facility that for potable reuse and that 13-mile pipeline that takes it inland to Anaheim, there aren't actually any wastewater treatment plants along that way. They're closer to us, nearer to the coast. Decentralized reuse is where you get the sewer shed that collects all the wastewater is very large with many pipelines that eventually bring all that, the smaller pipelines combine into bigger pipelines, and that's what takes the sewage to a wastewater treatment plant. You could go further upstream in that system and have a small potable water reuse facility built that would sort of tap into the raw sewage supply and do all the purification in a decentralized fashion. And that minimizes the cost of pipelines because you're grabbing the water source local to where the use would be. So I hope that makes sense. I know that's a lot for folks less familiar with it, so that might have been a little mixed up, but complex IPR versus like how to do DPR for your community is going to vary. So if we had to do it, I guess we would really take a step back and think about centralized versus decentralized DPR and where the water resources are in terms of wastewater that's available to be converted to a drinking water supply. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, decentralized direct potable reuse is pretty challenging. So
yeah,
makes sense what's going on.
Yeah, I guess I would just add to that from my prior comment that, you know, in the Orange County basin, the groundwater basin itself is such a big part of the infrastructure, right, of the system infrastructure, that to replicate the value that that provides in storage and distribution would be incredibly expensive. And so now you're not just increasing the treatment burden, which, you know, under your hypothetical, David, we wouldn't be changing. But you're also, like Megan said, you're recreating an entire distribution infrastructure that currently is being, that function is being fulfilled by the aquifer and the existing well system. So, you know, it makes perfect sense to me, Megan, that Orange County Water District is not at all interested in looking at DPR right now because of the great benefit from a you know, rope and boring, getting water from A to B perspective, as opposed to the really exciting, sexy, can we treat it to that standard question, which, you know, the answer to that question is yes. But of course there's, you know, that's the question everybody likes to try and answer and look at.
Great points. And it also, I think, resonates with something, Rabia, you said earlier and others mentioned also, that we are a big country with lots of diversity. Water is a local issue. There is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all solution. I want to give you the chance, Rabia, if you have a final word.
I don't have anything. I mean, this was fascinating to hear. I always love hearing about, you know, the utility perspectives. And, you know, one of the things that we're thinking about is trying to think about what would it take for a project sponsor to get a reuse project, you know, from beginning all the way to close, and what are the kind of barriers to entry there. And it's always, it's hard to do this at a national level because those questions, again, are really local. So Megan, thank you for explaining that. That was really helpful. I'm going to do like a quick little plug, actually, something that's a little separate. So to the students who are listening, the EPA Water Reuse team will be putting out an ORISE fellowship solicitation soon. We always have a few ORISE fellows who support our team, and we've been so lucky to have some great individuals who are now moving on to other endeavors. And so please watch for that. We would be excited to, you know, host some UCI graduates at the EPA. So I will make sure to share that with you, Shannon and David, when it's ready, just probably in a few weeks.
It's excellent, and we'll make sure that it's widely disseminated. David Hannigan, Eva Steinley-Darling, Megan Plumley, and Rabia Chowdhury Tremendous thanks. This was an extraordinary panel. I'm so glad it was recorded for those that did not have the opportunity to listen in live. Tremendous, many thanks to you for really an illuminating discussion on a very important set of issues. Again, everyone have a great rest of your day and a good weekend coming up. And stay tuned, May 18th, our final Water UCI colloquium. We'll get some information out on that soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.